a New York City Gilded Age tour. Hi, I'm Megan Murad, a licensed New York City tour guide, and today I am with
Keith Taillon, the operator of the Instagram account Keith York City, and also a licensed New York City tour guide.
Today, Keith is going to show us around some sites in New York City that are very important to New York City's Gilded Age, because it seems like the whole city has gone wild about the HBO series Gilded Age, as you can see behind us. And we're going to learn a little bit about what life was like during the Gilded Age, how we even got to that way of life, and some scandalous stories of Manhattan's elite. But before we get started, make sure that you click subscribe so you never miss a New York Minute.
Yeah, muffin talk. Ooh, muffin talk. Muffin talks, bringing healing to those who need it most.
I am so excited to be here with Keith Taillon of Keith York City, and he is the owner of one of the most amazing Instagram accounts about New York City. It's called Keith York City. And he actually has a tour company, and you can book a tour about the Gilded Age with him. I'm going to link that in the comments below. But without further ado, Keith, I want to know about the Gilded Age, and why are we starting here near Washington Square Park?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for the very kind introduction. The reason we're starting here at Washington Square when talking about the Gilded Age is because essentially the Gilded Age, technically, even though it didn't begin until about after the American Civil War in the 1860s, it really had its roots in the city's development in the 1820s. You have to remember that prior to the 19th century, New York City was kind of a provincial town, not much bigger than cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston. And it wasn't until the 1820s when the Erie Canal opened and really led to a massive boom in the economy and the population of New York City that the city began to grow north out of its Dutch origins down south of what's today Canal Street. So in the 1820s, where we're standing now, if you can peel back the centuries in your mind, where we're standing would have been farmland. What's now Washington Square was actually developed by the city as a potter's field or a burial ground for the city's poor and the city's victims of the various epidemics that washed through the city in the late 18th and early 19th century, like yellow fever, typhoid, and cholera. But like I said, in the 1820s, the city was growing really rapidly, and particularly the city's wealthy families were looking for a place to grow, to move, to get out of the dirty industrial commercial districts on the southern tip of the island where they had traditionally lived. So in 1825, the city shut down the potter's field, or the burial ground that was here, and turned the land into a park called Washington Square. Now, if you don't already know, there are still about 20,000 bodies buried beneath the park today. They didn't move many, if any, of the bodies out of the park when they turned it, or out of the potter's field when they turned it into a park. So when you're in Washington Square, just remember you're on top of the graves of about 20,000 old New Yorkers.
So the wealthy people were living on top of bodies.
Living around bodies,
okay.
Yes. And they were generally aware of this. I generally think people in past centuries were more, if not comfortable with, they were more accustomed to the idea of death. So I don't think it was quite such a creepy idea to live around a cemetery as we might consider it today. I always say that living next to a cemetery, you've got the quietest neighbors. They're not going to bother you. But anyway, one of the most important families to discuss when talking about the city's northward growth in the early 19th century was the Astor family. The Astor family patriarch was actually a German immigrant named John Jacob Astor, who moved to the United States. He was originally from a small town in Western Germany called Waldorf, which is where the word Waldorf comes from. But John Jacob Astor immigrated to the United States very shortly after the end of the American Revolution in the late 18th century. And he saw great opportunity in the fur trade in the New World, particularly in the trading of beaver pelts, which were very popular in Europe. So popular, in fact, that the European population had almost hunted the native European beaver to extinction in seeking to meet the demands of the European market in beaver pelts, which were used for hats and shawls and coats. So John Jacob Astor, a German immigrant, came to New York State and set himself up as a fur trader in upstate New York around what's today Albany. And he made a massive fortune in trading with the Native American tribes in northern New York for the pelts. Then he would tan them himself and sell them on the American and European fur markets at a massive profit. Now, what Astor did that was very smart, and why it ties into where we're standing today, is that John Jacob Astor took the money he made in the fur trade and invested it into real estate, which is something not many early merchants in the country thought to do. There was so much land in the early United States that it wasn't seen as something that was inherently valuable. But Astor, recognizing the potential for New York, and particularly New York City, to grow in the 19th century, bought up hundreds of acres of land in what was then the rural countryside north of the city, and what's today where we're standing in Greenwich Village, and just sat on it for decades as he waited for the city to catch up. And catch up it did in the 1820s, when places like Washington Square were opened and transformed this formerly rural district into an attractive residential development.
Following in the footsteps of Manhattan's elite, we have left Washington Square Park and we are now in Madison Square Park.
Correct.
So we are heading north.
Right.
Just like the wealthy have done throughout history.
Right.
Now, I remember Madison Square Park from the Gilded Age television series, when Marion and Mr. Rakes come here and they see the original torch of the Statue of Liberty.
Correct.
But why did you bring us here?
Right. So like you said, we're about a mile north of Washington Square here. So the general rule of thumb when talking about the northward progression of the city's population in the 19th century is that about every generation, every progressive generation in the city moved about a mile north up the city. So the families that were moving and establishing themselves around Madison Square and even Union Square just south of here were, generally speaking, not a hard rule, but generally a rule of thumb, they were the children or grandchildren of the older families that were living down in Lafayette Place or around Washington Square. So this was the next generation, often people who had grown up wealthy, and sort of the beginnings of the wealthy population that would become the main players in the Gilded Age a few decades later. Now, Madison Square not only coincided, the residential development of Madison Square not only coincided with the growth of the city, but it also coincided with a really rapid progression in technology in the city's development. When Washington Square developed, I mentioned earlier, it was sort of an effect or an outpouring of the city's growth. Erie Canal in the 1820s. Did you catch that?
Oh yeah.
A rat ran out from under us. By the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, as people began to push north out of Washington Square, out of Lafayette Place, they began to build similar mansions to what they had been building around Washington Square, around Union Square, up Broadway, up Fifth Avenue, and around Madison Square. So by the time you get up to Madison Square, and as this developed as a residential district, things like electric light had come onto the scene. The stretch of Broadway between Union Square and Madison Square, just south of here, was actually the first public street, I believe, in the country, definitely in New York City, to be fully lit by electric lamps. It was the first place where the term Great White Way began to be used, because it was lined by electric lights, it was lined with theaters, it was the city's first real theater district, so it was so brightly lit at night. When you think about a pre-electric world being as dark as it was shockingly bright.
This is one of the things that I mention a lot, is that, around like the 1880s, people would actually pay money to watch somebody turn a light bulb on.
Yeah.
Where today we're like, whatever, it's a light bulb.
Right.
But it was so magical. And like the Brooklyn Bridge was the first bridge to be lit using electric lights. And if you've never seen that before, how wild would it be to see a mile of that?
Right. And I really don't think that there's a modern day corollary to help us understand how shocking these technological advances were in the 19th century. So it's just something to keep in mind. These people, it wasn't just a growth of a city, it wasn't just a new neighborhood or a new district to move into, it was a completely different world being developed. Now the interesting thing, and when we talk about the city's residential development, especially as it pertains to the Gilded Age, is that I mentioned that Broadway was beginning to be infiltrated by commercialism. So Broadway was beginning to lose its residential cachet, especially by the time it reached Madison Square. And so there was almost a divide in Madison Square between people who lived on the north and the east sides in houses, and then places like on the west side where there was almost from the beginning commercial development. Where the Fifth Avenue building is over there today, what's now more famously known as the building where Italy is, was first developed as the Fifth Avenue Hotel. It was a commercial building that was sort of welcomed into the fold of residential elite development because it was a very fine hotel, and wealthy people and businessmen and politicians, when they came to stay in New York, they would stay either downtown at Astor House near City Hall Park or here at the Fifth Avenue Hotel. So there was this uneasy alliance here on Madison Square and on Union Square that was sort of unlike any other point in the city's northward movement, where commercial and residential development lived peacefully side by side. You had mansions and churches on this side, you had a hotel and some shops on that side, and for about a generation they were okay with each other. As when we're talking about who lived on Madison Square, one of the most exciting names to talk about is the Jerome family. The Jerome family lived over here, right where this black skyscraper is. And the important thing about that is that among the Jerome family, one of the daughters, Jenny Jerome, was among that wave of women in the Gilded Age that were married off to European nobility. American money, married to European titles. It was a very fashionable thing to do during the Gilded Age. Jenny Jerome was one of the most successful of these, what they call dollar princesses. She was married to, I believe, I hope I'm not misquoting this, but she was married to the Duke of Marlborough, and her son, Winston, later became Prime Minister of the UK, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill's mother was an American woman named Jenny Jerome, and she grew up right here on Madison Square.
We are continuing our walk uptown. We have left Madison Square Park, and we're now standing basically at the base of the Empire State Building. Now, when I'm bringing guests around, I don't normally bring people to the base of the Empire State Building to look at it, because you can't like actually see the top.
Right.
But this spot was very important for the Gilded Age.
Correct.
Why?
Correct. So we're standing here at the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue, home of the Empire State Building very famously today and for the last 91 years now. But the importance of this location to our conversation is that we're about half a mile.
New York City traffic. Woo! This is something. While we're standing in front of the Empire State Building, this is a place where we're going to see buses and taxis and hear horns.
Right.
It's New York City.
But
go with it.
But if you can imagine getting into your Gilded Age mindset, 170 years ago, this was like we've been kind of the theme of our conversation. This was mostly countryside, farmland. The streets were just being laid out. Often, if they were paved very crudely with stones or wood. And the residential districts that were moving their way north from Washington Square to Union Square to Madison Square didn't reach where we're standing until the 1850s, 10 or 20 years after those previously mentioned neighborhoods developed as neighborhoods. This area surrounding us is known today as Murray Hill. Historically, it's called Murray Hill because the Murray family had a farm here, and there actually was a hill here, so it was called Murray Hill. The Murray farm, they had a hill, Murray Hill.
No farms today.
Correct.
Just a lot of traffic.
So in the 1850s, as Madison Square began to transition into more of a commercial district, the children and sometimes cohort of the families like the Jeromes who had been living on Madison Square began to leapfrog half a mile north to where we're standing in the 30s on Murray Hill. This area around 5th and Madison Avenue in the 30s became the city's new elite address and remained that well into the actual Gilded Age in the 1880s and 1890s. Importantly to our conversation, we mentioned earlier the major character in the show, The Gilded Age, who was a real figure, Mrs. Astor, who was Caroline Skirmerhorn Astor. She was born on Battery Park. She grew up off of Lafayette Place. When she got married to William Backhouse Astor Jr., shortly after their wedding, William's father, William Backhouse Astor Sr., gave William Backhouse Astor Jr. and his brother, John Jacob Astor III, neighboring plots of land right here at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. So on the far side at 33rd Street and 5th Avenue was the home of John Jacob Astor III and his wife Charlotte Augusta Gibbs. On the closer corner at 34th Street was the home of William Backhouse Astor Jr. and his wife Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, who would become Mrs. Astor. Both houses were built in the early 1850s, very early on in the development of this neighborhood. The mansions that went up here were very piecemeal, kind of wherever families were acquiring plots of land. And we talked earlier about how John Jacob Astor was very good at buying land north of town. That's part of what this was. The Astors purchased an old farm up here in the middle of nowhere and just waited around for the land to become valuable, and then they parceled off the pieces around here. Now, what happened with the Astors who lived here is that there was a debate with the death of William Backhouse and John Jacob III's mother. I think her name was Margaret Astor, don't quote me on that. With the death of their mother, who was a social leader in the pre-Gilded Age Society of New York, when she died, I think in the 1870s, again, don't quote me on that. When she died, there was a debate over who should next inherit the title of Mrs. Astor. Because you have to understand, in society, on society lists, there could only be one Mr. and Mrs. Blank. Everyone else that was less societally important than them would be Mr. and Mrs. William Blank or Mr. and Mrs. John Blank. So to get the simplistic title of Mrs. Astor was it meant something more than just vanity. So with the death of William Backhouse and John Jacob III's mother, there was debate over whether the title should pass to Caroline Astor because she was the older of the two women, or to Charlotte Augusta Gibbs because she was married to the older of the two brothers. There was an uneasy alliance reached where neither of them really claimed the title, but what happened was Charlotte Augusta Gibbs, Caroline's sister-in-law, died rather young. And so then the title Caroline believed should pass to her as the senior Astor woman in New York society. However, John Jacob III and Charlotte had a son named William Waldorf Astor, the middle name Waldorf after the ancestral hometown of the Astor family in Germany. William Waldorf believed that the title of Mrs. Astor should pass patrilineally down to his wife, whereas Caroline believed it should pass to her as the elder Astor woman. Caroline, however, being the older woman and being by that point in the 1880s already very prominent in New York society, just went ahead and ordered her calling cards that said Mrs. Astor, essentially going over the head of her nephew and his wife. William Waldorf Astor was so offended by this social usurpation that he took his family and moved to England, where they established themselves as the English Astors. The house which he inherited at 33rd and 5th, next to his aunt Caroline, he had it demolished and planned to build the city's largest horse stables on the site, so that his aunt, who he was very bitter toward, would be forced to live next to the smell of horses, horse crap, and hay for the rest of her life. Now, William Waldorf's financial advisor told him this wasn't a good idea, stables would not be a good moneymaker, and he encouraged William Waldorf to instead build a massive hotel on the site. Something large and commercial that would overshadow literally his aunt's mansion on 34th Street, but would also make him money. So what William Waldorf did is when he tore down his father's house on the site, he built a 13-story hotel called the Waldorf. Now, his aunt, Mrs. Astor, lived in the shadows of the Waldorf for about 2 years before she finally cried uncle and gave up, had her home demolished. She moved up to 65th Street, and in place of her mansion here at 34th Street, she had an even larger hotel built called the Astoria. So you had the Waldorf and the Astoria neighboring each other right here from the mid-1890s until the 1920s. It wasn't until Caroline died and her son John Jacob IV died on the Titanic and William Waldorf died that the two grandsons, Waldorf Astor from England and Vincent Astor, the son of John Jacob IV, made peace and combined the two into a joint hotel called the Waldorf Astoria. Now in the 1920s, as this district began to transition into more of a commercial space, and it was increasingly less attractive as a hotel district, that the Astor cousins agreed to sell the land to real estate developers. The Waldorf Astoria was torn down and replaced by the world's tallest skyscraper, the Empire State Building. So essentially the Empire State Building is the least interesting of the three buildings that stood on this site.
I know that we're working our way uptown, but why are we standing in front of a Victoria's Secret?
Right. That's a really great question. And the fact of the matter is that where we're standing in this extremely commercialized, skyscraper-filled stretch of Fifth Avenue north of 42nd Street below Central Park, this was actually where most of the prime action of Gilded Age society took place. After the 1870s, beginning in the 1880s, mostly new money families like the Vanderbilts were among the pioneers, the post-Mary Mason Jones pioneers, to push north of 42nd Street and begin establishing their mansion compound on Fifth Avenue. They sort of took a chance on moving this far north. Now, for the Vanderbilts in particular, this location is particularly appropriate because the heirs to the original Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Commodore Vanderbilt, who established the Vanderbilt family fortune in making ferries and buying up train lines in the early 19th century, his heirs took their inheritance when he died in 1877 and decided to establish the biggest, most elaborate mansions the city had ever seen here on this stretch of Fifth Avenue. Now, specifically, the main heir of the Commodore, the original Cornelius Vanderbilt, was William Henry Vanderbilt, more commonly known as Billy Vanderbilt. Billy inherited the bulk of Cornelius's estate in 1877, along with his two sons, his eldest son Cornelius II and his second son William Cassam Vanderbilt. They inherited several $1 million from Cornelius. And with those millions, Billy Vanderbilt, the main heir of Cornelius, built here where Victoria's Secret and Nike are today, what was known as the Vanderbilt Triple Palace. It was three mansions that actually looked like two, massive brownstone mansions separated by a courtyard in the center. The northern half of it, where Victoria's Secret is today, was one giant mansion just for Billy Vanderbilt and his wife. On the other side of the courtyard, what appeared to be a fraternal twin to Billy's mansion, inside to two mansions for his eldest two daughters and their husbands and children. Just beyond the Nike store where the sisters lived, on the closer corner of that dark glassy skyscraper on the corner of 52nd Street, was the limestone chateau of William Cassam Vanderbilt, the second son of Billy. So right here where we're standing, and why we're standing here talking today, is because right here in a row were four members of the Vanderbilt family who all moved here around 1882 when their houses were completed. When you talk about things like the 1883 Vanderbilt ball that Alva Vanderbilt threw at her house that helped the Vanderbilts establish themselves in high society, that took place in the William Cassam Chateau right there at 52nd Street. Now, the tough part of this story, and the part that's hard for a lot of people to understand, both online or in my tours, is why none of these houses still exist today. It can sometimes be difficult for me as a historian and as a tour guide to paint the picture in people's heads of what this place used to look like. But there's a very logical reason why none of these mansions still stand today, and that logical reason is the bedrock of New York's development over the centuries. It was the desire for money and money through commercial development. So as these houses became surrounded by commerce, they became less attractive as residential spaces, and the land then became more valuable than the house that sat on it. So the families would either die off and then their estates would sell the building to commercial developers, or the families themselves, like the cases of the Gillettes around, just a couple blocks out of shot here. The Gillettes, when their patriarch died, they didn't want to inherit this old dowdy mansion, and they didn't want to live in what was rapidly becoming a commercial district. So these mansions, which for a generation had defined the opulence of the Gilded Age, started by the Vanderbilts in the 1870s and 80s, by about 1900 or 1910, were out of fashion and unwanted. So they were sold off at great profit to the family's benefit to usually commercial developers who would tear down the mansions and develop them as modern skyscrapers.
Thank you so much. Like I said, I'm a licensed New York City tour guide, so I give tours, but something that's so wonderful about guides is we all have our specialties, and Keith specializes in things that I don't. So I'm so thankful to Keith for for answering my email at all, because he's such a celebrity amongst New York City historians. Make sure that
Thank
you
you.
follow his Instagram,
Yep.
Keith York City. And again, I'm linking this website where you can book your own Keith tour. It's amazing, and I mean, this is just like a tiny sampling. There's so much more,
Yeah.
and his brain is so big, and he will answer any questions you have.
I could
about
talk
New
for
York City
days,
history.
yes.
It's so amazing. So thank you,
Yeah, thank you.
and thank you so much for watching, and remember to click subscribe.